I'm Wendy Blom, Executive Director of Lowell Telecommunications Corporation. Thank you so much for joining us for this very important discussion about the strife that's happening right now in Southern Cameroon. I have with me today two very distinguished panelists to talk about this. Nkimbeng is a Cameroonian-American and a member of the Board of Directors of Lowell Telecommunications Corporation. He's originally from Southern Cameroon, and he is a community activist and organizer here in Lowell, Massachusetts.
Thank you.
Dr. Patrice Nganang is a Cameroonian writer, poet, and currently a professor in comparative literature at Princeton University in New Jersey. He was born in Yaoundé, Cameroon, and was educated in Cameroon and Germany. He was awarded a PhD in comparative literature at the Johann Wolfgang Goethe University. On December 7th, 2017, Dr. Nganang was arrested in the Douala airport where he was to catch a flight on Kenya Airways to Zimbabwe. It was the day after he published an article in the French news magazine Jeune Afrique criticizing Mr. Biya's government for its handling of protests in English-speaking Cameroonians. Mr. Nganang was detained for 3 weeks in Cameroon. And the questions I'm going to ask tonight come from Southern Cameroonians from around the world. First of all, can you please tell us about your last trip to Africa and what you experienced in Cameroon and your article that led to your arrest?
I think it may require a book actually to talk about what I went through and you know, to present the details not only of my ordeal but also the details of the beauty I saw and of the spirit of the people I met and discussed with. The thing is that I went to Cameroon in November and December 2017 because I am working on a novel about a civil war, and the Cameroonian civil war that happened between 1956 and 1970. And as a matter of coincidence, you know, a substantial time of that civil war space, I will even say, was Southern Cameroon's. So it means I decided to travel there for the specific reasons that I wanted to have a fact-checking experiment of my own novel. But the second reason was that I've been, you know, since 2005, indeed, I've been involved, and even before going there, I was involved in, you know, the fight of, you know, the revolt, I'll call it that way, or even the rebellion, the Anglophone rebellion. So I wanted to meet the people, the leaders, I wanted to meet the activists, I wanted to see the people who on the ground mobilize and make sure that their voices are heard. I wanted to meet them and listen to their story. But also, of course, I wanted to meet the population in general, to see how they live through some of the decisions that are being taken. So as you can see, you have many layers that made me go there. But I arrived at a moment when Biya had declared a war against the Anglophones. So which for all of us was a stunning moment. And so therefore I would say I wanted to understand what it is to be in a country where the president suddenly declares war against you. Because from the get-go, it was clear to me that the people he was addressing were not the people who were living there. So in a sense, the population was in what I simply understood as being a historical moment, and yet he was addressing a particular figure that he wanted to construct as an enemy, and that figure didn't match with what I knew before. So I wanted to have a sense of what it is to live in a country where suddenly you watch TV and the president of the country says that he has declared war against you. So it will take a book really to talk about all those things, as you can see. Yeah, so you wrote about that and published it in a magazine, and they found out and arrested you? Yes, that is the summary of it. Yeah. As you can see, one can say that in 2 sentences. Yes. Yes, but even there, it will be a little bit difficult for me because, you see, a sentence can be sanitized for a magazine in Paris. I felt there are some things that need to be presented. But I must say from from the get-go that I have a specific understanding of what a writer does. And I've done that in Mali, in South Africa, in Rwanda, etc. I come in a country where there is a crisis. For instance, in Mali, they were also in a situation of civil war. I travel around and I listen to people. I take tour. I did it in Burkina Faso too, etc. I take time, 1 month or so, and I listen to everybody. On the street, every single where I go, I meet officials, and I simply talk about anything to understand where do their children go to school, what do they eat as breakfast, something like that, just to understand the combination of their daily life. And that is what I did in Southern Cameroon. But it was also important to me to present how it is felt from the side of those who speak French. So to see that those who, the Francophones as they are called, how they relate to a war that is being started. So that is somehow the summary of my article in Jeune Afrique. So my question was, can Biya win the war that he is waging now? And of course the answer is no, because the solution to the problem, that was my conclusion, is that Biya has to go. And because from the side of the Francophones themselves, and it is an observation I could easily make since I was mobilizing people during 2 or 3 years to build schools, to help children, to clean up streets, etc. Most Francophones send their children to Anglophone schools. And one doesn't even need to argue about it, because it makes sense to send children to Anglophone schools because it has more potential. It's their possibility to have a job later is larger, etc. As a consequence, you have the future that's already taken by that population of youngsters who are 10 years old, who are 12, 15 years old, and who in the future are going to be Anglophones. So it doesn't make any sense to declare war against those who are Anglophones when your own children actually are becoming Anglophones.
Well, it does seem nonsense, that's true. But Fru, give us a little background about how this all started in recent times.
Well, generally, history holds that there were 2 Cameroons. The English Cameroon, administered by the British, and then the French Cameroon, administered by the French. So in 1960, the French Cameroon had its independence. Their president was Amadou Ahidjo. In 1954, the English Cameroon, still under the British trusteeship, had a self-rule. They had multi-party system, democratic system. So from 1953 to 1961, they had 3 successive governments. The government of Dr. Endele, the government of Dr. Foncha, and then the government of Premier Joa. So this in a short period of time. But during that time, in 1960, as I mentioned, French Cameroon got its independence. Then, in 1961, English Cameroon was supposed to have its own independence, but there were only 2 options. Either you have your independence by joining Nigeria, which is also English-speaking country, or you have your independence by joining the Republic of Cameroon, which is French. So because the English side had had a very bad experience in Nigeria, they walked out of the Nigerian parliament and then formed their own state. So we felt that it was but good to have a union with French Cameroon, and that union was actually cemented under the foundation and the understanding to make a federal state. And the symbolism was very clear, and the flag was green, red, yellow with 2 stars, 2 equal stars representing the 2 countries. So since when that happened, and it is worthwhile mentioning that the French Cameroon is 80% of the population, and then the English Cameroon is only 20% of the population. And economically, most of the English Cameroon actually contributes almost 66% of the national GDP. So fast forward around 1972, they organized a referendum that is to unite the country, and the reasons being probably definitely because of economic reasons. So if you logically would think that 80% and then 20%, the results of the referendum was already evident before we even do it. So now the country now became a United Republic of Cameroon. So most of the administrative of the country now was controlled by the French Cameroon, and the English Cameroon almost lost its identity. Infrastructure, economically, education, culturally, and everything, we were really marginalized and left out of the government, in as much as, I mean, we were part of the country and so patriotic, but they call the English Cameroon, most Francophones were made to believe that the English Cameroon are not true Cameroons because they call them Nigerians. They give them labels like the enemy in the house within. So those things were not very comforting, and plus the fact that we didn't have a say in the government. So this fomented a lot of resentment. So in spite of repeated calls for addressing this issue, the government only answered with an iron fist. So in 2016, the teachers presented their grievances to the government and called just for a simple dialogue. We are children of the same father. It's more or less like you are a father, you have two children, one Francophone, one Anglophone. The other one is telling you that I am not feeling fine. These are my problems. Instead of listening, the government asked them to meet together. They meet, the government heard from them, and what did the government do? The government started arresting their leaders. The lawyers too, they were also fed up because the English legal system, the common law, was almost undermined and trampled upon and overtaken by the French system. They wanted also to address these issues, but the government will not listen. They said dialogue is better than solving problem under the barrel of the gun. But sometimes, you know, when you push someone too far against the wall, the only thing that you can do is react. So we are at the point where the English Cameroon is reacting.
And I understand there's a problem with the Bamilekes. The tribe Bamilekes are, explain what's happening with them and how they were helped by the Southern Cameroonians in the 1960s, but now are fighting on the other side.
Well, I mean, I think that question is really a very complicated question. And since you said these questions come from all over the world, these questions really directed at Professor Nganang because the Bamilekes,
I was running away from this question.
Oh, I'm sorry.
Naturally, the Bamilekes, culturally and traditionally, they are more close to the Graffy land, even the Northwestern and Bamenda, and so we have a similar culture. So when they were being prosecuted in the 60s, as the professor mentioned that he was studying about civil war, that was the crisis. So most of them, they sought refuge in English Cameroon. We welcomed them, and because of the oppression that they were being, the persecution and the killings, they came over, so we opened arms and welcomed them. So apparently, I cannot really speak to the fact of that, but my understanding and what I hear from people on the ground, because what I'm saying shouldn't be taken as a gospel truth. I've been out of the country for this while, so I have to make that very clear. So they are saying that most of these Bamilekes, people who came over and they were given, they were welcome when they were also being prosecuted, some of them are siding with the government and forgetting that once upon a time, they were in the same situation and they were helped. And to also remind them that this train has left the train station, and independence is just a matter of when. So let me not talk too much.
Maybe you can speak a little bit
can
about that.
Yes, I'll be short and long, and I'll say the long version is that there is, empire in general wages wars in remote places and forgets about those wars. But the people who live in those remote places do not forget. And they live with the legacy of those wars that are forgotten in Germany, in France, in the US. Those are forgotten wars. But the people in those regions live with those wars on a daily basis. Now, Cameroon was a German colony before. So one will have to always remember that Cameroon was actually created by the Germans. So in other words, before the Germans, we loved each other. We had social relations. We had systems of kinship. We had chieftaincies, kingdoms, etc. But we did not have something that was called Cameroon. And that brought all those people under one singular umbrella that is somehow the beginning of what we have now as a state. So, in a sense, the Cameroonian state is an invention of colonialism. Yes. But the problem is that the Germans lost the war. And they actually did it twice. The consequence, of course, of that lost war is that the feeling, the consequences, or the ramifications, if you want, of that lost war in Africa are not that important for Germany. That's why I mentioned the case before of empire that wages wars without knowing, the ramifications of it in the periphery. But yet they are important for Cameroonians because one specific group, the Bamileke, was split in two. One part became part of the British Empire. Another part became part of the French Empire. And the way those two were ruled inside those new entities made them somehow become strangers to each other. Even though when you walk in the Northwest, when you walk in Lebialem, etc., as a Bamileke, you are at home. And equally, when somebody from the Northwest or from Lebanon walks in the Francophone part of the Bamileke land, that person will be at home because it is really, literally the same thing. And now colonialism has that particularity of inventing new names for things that are old. So as a consequence, the French-speaking Bamileke were called Bamileke, and the English-speaking Bamileke were called Grafi. You see?
Interesting.
It's true, and it becomes uglier indeed, because when you take the birth certificates, the marriage certificates of people of a particular generation, you see there's a mention on it, race. What's the race? And the race is Bamileke. So it means it was a mark already that administratively split that group that was uniform before, but also transformed it into a race. As you can see, you already had the seeds of a potential conflict that was there. It needed only a crisis for it to blossom, to become bloody, if you want, which is what we are having. In 1955, it happens, of course, that one had the first crisis. And the crisis blossomed amongst, particularly amongst the French-speaking Bamileke. And socially, since they feel at home in that English-speaking part anyway, because it is the same culture. You remember you had a social relation, you had an interaction, you had marriages, etc. So they will go to their family.
Yes, that's true.
And on top of it, that family, back then in 1955, was part of Nigeria, was part of the British Empire, which means they were out of the French-speaking zone where they were in danger anyway. where they were facing a genocide. So they did not only find shelter in a family, in their family, they also found shelter in a country that could protect them. You see, so that is the constellation of 1955. And today, those two countries came back together, but they didn't forget the memory of those conflictual situations, because pain is something that one doesn't forget easily. People tend to forget love, but pain is something that is deeply rooted. It stays for a while, and people keep remembering those negativities. That is somehow what is coming out for the second time. So it is the second coming of something that that is painful, if you want, and that will have been cleared away if one had, and one has a leadership that will make people understand that on both sides one can actually forget those colonial boundaries and start rebuilding something that can be a social understanding around the things that one has in common.
Yeah, that sounds very good. But explain to me, coming from French Cameroon, are there many French Cameroonians who believe like that you do, that they need to really take into consideration the demands of the English-speaking side? And why do you have such a passion for this?
The thing is that anywhere where injustice is on the table, I tend to be actually alerted. So that is my reaction. I think maybe I have it from my own education, from the home where I was brought up, from all those things. So standing for minorities, for minority rights, and standing for Anglophone since I was a student, I would say it is simply part of my DNA. That having said that, I think. The issue is if one could find not only me, but also more people who understand that there is something that is simply wrong that's going on in Southern Cameroon, and that there is no excuse in silence. There is no excuse in simply saying that one is not concerned. And indeed, if one could find ways to rekindle those social formations that will make it possible for Anglophones to find a shelter, indeed, amongst the people who were helped during the 50s or even before, who share the same social values from the very beginning, one would have helped a minority that is currently in danger. So because I think it is very difficult to bring people together under what one calls ideology, because they are, in general, lofty sentences. But when one brings them together under an umbrella of things that are their social practices, the things that they do every single day, if one awakens their social relations or even their tribal relations for something good, then they understand it very fast. Because then, for instance, for organizations, for fundraising, for help, for shelter, etc., one will have a way. So I think it is not only a matter of me personally, it is a matter of having more voices that will see through that when there is injustice, one has to stand there and actually defend the wounded, defend the person who is unjustly treated, and stand by the person who is wronged.
Well, Fru, you are here in America, and you are also very passionate about this. What is the role of civic leaders in this crisis, both in Africa and in the diaspora?
Well, I think it is very, very important. Education is the key. And as Professor Nganang has said, you see, our greatest problem in Cameroon is the denial to know your history. Not the denial, but deliberate. The government in place has deliberately refused Cameroonians that opportunity to know their heritage. And now, this has actually awakened that birthright in people to see that the government has really taken their birthright and taken what belongs to ours for granted and pitch us against everyone. So as a civil rights or activists outside, my role is really to dig the truth. Because definitely it said that if you don't know where you are coming from, you wouldn't be able to know where you are going. And our identity, my father always said that our culture is our identity. And culture is who defines us. And definitely part of what in Cameroon, from what I look at it, is that aspect of actually not knowing your history and not knowing what your identity is. You see, so, but then when you start knowing this crisis has awakened both the Francophones and the Anglophones to reflect, do a self-reflection as to all the lies that we have been told. It's more or less that we have actually been emasculated and taken brainwash not to feel Cameroonians. So that aspect of Cameroonian and knowing who you are, as Prof mentioned, the connection that existed, because if that was really into play, this problem would not have actually gone that far. Because he rightly mentioned, we were brothers. That is why they called for dialogue. That is why the system did not really see it that way.
Yes.
I'd like to maybe put some a layer on that aspect of colonialism. It is that the conflict escalated so rapidly, but at the same time, if you compare it with other conflicts across the African continent, you will see that it's the same pattern. So you have something that will have been settled if the people will have called each other and will have talked. It's transformed into a battle on the street, and now it is when it's sending troops, etc., etc. But now in that chaos, when you start looking closely and when you compare how the state is reacting to how during the 50s and 70s, that same state reacted against the fighters for independence who wanted independence for Cameroon and were obliterated by the state. If you compare the two, you will see that there are so many similarities. And for instance, the burning of villages. So because now that is what is happening, the state is sending soldiers and they simply randomly burn villages. And they burn older people in those houses, and they kill randomly, and it is amazingly gruesome and amazingly brutal. It's simply genocide. So one has reached a level where one wonders what makes a state react that way. Is that state brain dead? But indeed, that state is brain dead, because that state repeats the same tactics that were used in the 60s and 70s against the people who wanted independence. And here it is essential to always remember that in Cameroon in general, including Southern Cameroons, in Cameroon, the people who got independence are not the people who wanted it. So it is quite particular. It is important to underline it because in the US one tends to take for granted that George Washington, for instance, he fought for independence and he became president. It makes sense. He won, etc., and became president. That is the logics of history. That is how it should be. And in many African countries, in Zimbabwe, etc., it was like that. So Mugabe fought for independence, he won independence, and etc., etc. In Cameroon, those who became president, etc., until today, they are the people who campaign against independence. So in their political platform was that Cameroonians are not
ripe enough for
independence. Cameroonians need time to be independent. Cameroon should stay colonized. Cameroon should actually not be independent. And they did not want it. That was their platform. Those who said Cameroon should become independent, they were all murdered. So that is the constellation of Cameroonian history, and it's the constellation into which Southern Cameroonians entered. So they entered into a country that was at war with itself already, because it had obliterated all the people who wanted independence, and those who murdered them actually those who did not want independence. So they actually had committed a murder. They could hide all the blood and bodies and welcome the Southern Cameroonians and say, come and stay with us. Since everybody who was for independence was in exile anyway, so there was no way one could say, watch out, they are murderers. So having that as the bottom line of any discussion, you see, the state itself cannot have a memory of its actions because it has no it has no reason to actually show the bodies that it had hidden, sometimes in concrete, sometimes in mass graves, etc. It had no interest in presenting the history of its own murders, had no interest even in naming the people who fought for independence, because even until today, the President of Cameroon has never mentioned the name of the people who actually wanted independence, and yet Cameroon is independent and is the country is the president of a country that is independent because of those people, you see, of whom he murdered. And he was, because he's 85, he's part of the generation that committed that murder. So in summary, I would like to say that you have a state that is run by amnesia, a criminal amnesia, and you have a state that has as its tactics to deepen that amnesia, to make the population be complicit of that amnesia, forget its social bonds, its roots, its communities, its way of dealing with each other, its dialogue with each other. You have a state that actually has no interest in making people understand that they are sisters and brothers. Right? So because of that, that state can use in 2018 the very tactics that it used in 1960.
It sounds like a desperate government
It
that
is
maybe is
indeed.
on its way down.
There we go. It is a desperate government, and I think, therefore, any single sentence, any single word is automatically an atom bomb, my arrest. And even me, I could not stop laughing, because I was telling them that, look, my friends, come on, a small text, you arrest me because of that? You must be so desperate. What is going on in your mind? And these are individuals who have been trained in France, have been trained in the US, meaning they have been here and there, so they are well versed with international conversations. And I tell them that, look, it simply doesn't make sense what you are doing. This jail where you are putting me is full of people like you. They are ministers. They are in jail, all of them. So how are you going to deal with it? If one stays even on the Anglophone cause, you have close to 700 people in jail now who are in jail because, one, sometimes they were on the street without an ID, because they actually maybe were arrested when they were walking, because they were witnessing an event. They were arrested in their home. They were arrested in their yard. They were arrested in their plantation. 700 of them in Yaoundé, in Douala, in Kumba, in Bamenda, scattered around. What are you going to do with those people? Now they are being sentenced on charges of terrorism, financing of terrorism, things like that. It is, the discrepancy between, on the one hand, a young man who is 20 years old who didn't have an ID, and the charge against him is so high, and he gets 11 years in jail, and without any lawyer, zero lawyer. The sentence is read to him in French when he's an English speaker. It is so ridiculous. It's as ridiculous as a grandmother who is in her home, and the home is being burned down. She doesn't even speak English in the first place, as one will say. So with that, you have a state that is really desperate because it is running away from its own past. It is running away from its own culpability.
And the thing is, the system in Cameroon, an educated Cameroonian is more dangerous than a Cameroonian with a gun. So that is why the system right now, they are doing everything to eliminate the youths. Most of the youths who are fighting now, they are all university graduates.
Yeah, they are.
If you eliminate the illiterate ones, you are left with those that you give them guns to go on like your henchmen. And the youngest person in the government, is about 60 years old. It will baffle you to know that the president just appointed a parliamentary, a senator, appointed, not being elected, who is 101 years old.
Oh my gosh.
What does he really have to contribute?
Yeah.
And that is the dinosaur that rules Cameroon.
What is your goal? If you are successful in getting rid of this government, what is the goal?
Dialogue.
Dialogue?
Yes, dialogue. I think I always say that if one gets rid of those people who, meaning not get rid, but if one actually puts them into the well-deserved retirement, and Cameroonians have social bonds that will overcome any form of division, because as you see, if there is a beauty in colonialism, it is that it made sure to have borders cross groups, tribes, families that had everything with each other. So the issue is to bring back those things that people had with each other, for them to be able to talk with each other and indeed find a way to decide over their own future. If the future is, well, we love you very much, and for instance, guess what? France has a part that speaks German, and it is still France, it's not Germany. So we love you very much, but you will stay in Cameroon even though you speak English. Or you can also say, guess what? We don't want to. They say, then we find a way to actually go apart. So, but one cannot do either of those propositions without talking with each other. So that is the bottom line. And the government that comes to and kills all the time doesn't have any solution for that.
Another thing is, following the history of the current Cameroon, dialogue is good. But the thing is, as we got together, what should be done now? If there's any meaningful solution, there should be a plebiscite or a referendum for Southern Cameroon to decide its future. You see?
Yes.
Southern Cameroon to decide its future, whether you want to be in this relationship or you want to stay alone. Because a forced abusive relationship, as we have experienced, the next thing is death, right? So in that situation, to be very, very fair and going back to the days of unification, Southern Cameroon opted. It's very clear, it's very important that the world should equally know that Southern Cameroon was never defeated in war or never colonized. These were two people of equal status that came into, let me say, some sort of an agreement, you see. Then if it behooves also at this particular point that the other side has waged war on this side,
Yeah.
you give both of them, let them reflect to see if, in fact, they would want to join that union or not, and not to dictate a solution for them.
Yeah, that didn't work in the past.
That didn't
why
work.
Should it work
Yes.
in the future? If you did get independence for Southern Cameroon, what is the chances of a successful state if it's so small, just like South Sudan is having trouble now when it's separated?
I think that's one of the most crucial questions that really needs some sort of explanation, and there are so many reasons to actually solidify and proven that. You have mentioned Sudan and those other failed states, which is very true. But if we run down our memory lane, I will tell you that Southern Cameroon in the 50s was one of the most progressive and organized states democratically. They, from 1953 to 1958, they had 3 successive governments, elected government, multi-party systems. And as I mentioned, the parties, the opponents, the opposition parties, they were campaigning together. So there was no war amongst them. They conducted an election. The first prime minister was Dr. Ndele. After 2 years, there was another election. He lost to Dr. John Go Foncha. Peaceful transfer of power. Then from Dr. John Go Foncha to Premier Jua, and then even in 1970 from Premier Jua to Premier Solomon Tandeng Muna. So these are successive four. And then secondly, you cannot compare Southern Cameroon with Sudan. The literacy level of Southern Cameroonians is one of the highest in Africa. I alluded earlier that what the current government is doing, they are trying to kill the literate Southern Cameroonians, because history has proven that an educated Southern Cameroonian and an educated Cameroonian is more dangerous with a pen and with a mind than a Southern Cameroonian if you give him a machine gun on the street.
Yes. What about all of the problems happening in Nigeria? Would Southern Cameroon be able to defend itself from Boko Haram or what is going on there without a bigger country to?
I think it is essential to maybe widen the scope and realize somehow that that each time you have an experiment in tyranny, one consequence is in general also the breaking apart of the country. So you have Sudan, you have Somalia, and etc. So one can multiply those examples. And you have Cameroon now, where you have somebody who is in power since 35 years, who's 85 years old. You have a political class made of people who are close to 100 years old. So one of the you have a reaction of a government running away from its past, and a population that's desperate really for a change, for dialogue, for something to happen, for something new. So I'll flip the question and rather say that each time you have a long-term tyranny, one of the consequences across the globe, you can take Russia, etc., the Balkan, one of the consequences is the breaking apart of the country. Because people simply cannot live in a tyranny, and that is what is happening. And the memory of democracy is something that you cannot kill. And you can take even Germany. You have, during the Hitler years, people were remembering that during the Weimar times, they had democracy, and they were connected to that democratic experiment to build something new. So what I'm trying to say is that the example of a failed state will not deter people from looking into the successful democratic experiment they had.
That's very
and
true.
Even history also shows us that it is that democratic experiments defeat terror easily, because people understand that their interest is to defeat terrorism. So Boko Haram will never prevail in front of a democracy. So that one is impossible. So I will say, let us start with that deep-seated tyranny running away from its past, repeating its own violence in front of all of us, and brutally creating a genocide in front of all of us. And if we look at it, one will see that the problem is not the fear of a new country, of a new state. The problem is the continuity of a failed experiment of democracy and the continuity of tyranny. That is where fear should actually be.
Yes. And what is the role of people in the diaspora to move the resistance forward?
Well, I think the people in the diaspora have done wonderful, but my heart goes out to the people on ground zero. They are paying the ultimate price with blood, sweat, tears, without even any oxygen. Whatever happens in the diaspora, we are standing just on the shoulders of those who are at ground zero, and I cannot acknowledge that enough. What I would really like us in the diaspora is to be united, because the worst enemy is internal fighting, you see, because unity is power, and unity is vision of purpose. But once you take your eye all that and start but looking amongst yourself, I believe that there is in the diaspora we at times take our eyes off the prize and focus it but on individuals. So if we can really give that moral support to the people on ground zero and educate them to be able to save some lives, it will go a long way. I think, Professor, you may have a lot to say on this.
Because I've been touring the diaspora since I left Cameroon, and I've been talking to communities in the US, in Europe, and now I'm going to do it in Africa too, Cameroonian communities, talking with them. And I will first of all say that it is amazing to realize how organized the Southern Cameroonians are. And I suspect it is when a crisis, when fire hits a home, that people suddenly come together and fight to stop the fire. Because I've never seen so much goodwill and so much structured organization and understanding that there is a prize in a struggle, and that the prize can only be achieved when one is united for that. I just came out of 2 fundraisers where, where I was simply flabbergasted, just to say the truth. And now I'm here in Boston, in Lowell, and I'm going through steps that I suspect otherwise would not necessarily have been possible, would not have been possible. And I think it is a testimony of the strength of the diaspora. I must stay though, because I did, and I'm going to continue doing that similar things in Europe amongst Francophones. I must say that Cameroon is divided fundamentally between those who speak English and those who speak French. And history of that division is, of course, colonial, but the legacy of it is post-colonial. It has to do with the state of tyranny that is based on the Francophones to oppress the Anglophones specifically, but also any other group that will express a form of dissent. So amongst the Francophones, there is a fundamental denial of what is happening to the Anglophones, to the Southern Cameroonians. There is even a will not to listen. There is a refusal to see the killings. There is a body reaction in front of the blood that's being spilled. People simply fundamentally look away. And that one is a reaction, I would say, of a propaganda machine that has been working so heavily in, to make the Francophones look away. Because of the state TV, because of the state media, because of a price that's put on the head of anybody who expresses dissent. So I will not say the same about the French-speaking diaspora, because there the spirit of understanding, of simply not even of listening, is not yet there. And I hope through my own industry, to the industry of people of goodwill, that one will come to a moment when people will speak to the Francophone diaspora and tell her that what is happening to one life should be enough to awaken somebody of conscience. And that after all, English and French are not our languages.
That's very right. They are not our identity.
Yes. Yes.
But we share the same blood.
Yes. Yeah. And just to add on that, when we talk, the politicians have been able to mastermind and brainwash even our brothers Francophones to believe that Cameroon is one and undivided. Mm-hmm. Let's just look at that statement. This whole body is one body. Just even the nail, if the nail on one finger hurts, what happens?
Right. The whole body is in jeopardy.
Right. I'm trying to enter the minds of my brothers and sisters Francophone. And as the professor said earlier, most of the Francophones send their students to the English side. Now they are not going to school because for 2 years now, there is no school going on in the English side. Yes, we are one body. when the finger hurts, it hurts only the right side, but the left side doesn't hurt. Yes, we are one body. And with this mentality, it becomes very, very difficult to tell that finger that that finger is part of that body.
You know, there is, the moment of defeat for any Francophone, certainly, will come when the person's child who has gone through an English system will ask his parents or her parents, why are Anglophones being killed, actually? And why are schools, why are houses, why are villages being burned in Anglophone land? Why is blood being spilled in Amba land when I learn English myself? It simply does not make sense. And the absurdity of all that is such that one will have to come to always simply that bottom line. And I think it is a double bottom line. The first is that one has a generation, a political generation, that has fed itself of the body of Cameroonians, run away from its crimes, and has made sure that people forget their own history. One has to go away from that political class to find the bonds of the social fabric that one had before, to make sure that indeed churches, mosques, traditional societies, secret societies, etc., that one shared, that one builds in those places, the roads for a renewed dialogue. And I think civil society is capable of doing that. If in front of a crisis, people jump to the occasion, for instance, like I saw, to reconnect, what was lost, what maybe didn't exist before, it is possible on the ground too. And it is a challenge. But I think it is also a matter of a new generation that is coming up to realize that whatever the solution, be it the constitution of a new state, be it the keeping of the old state in a new form, so one will have to talk with each other across those two cultures and languages, etc., to find either
the same
solution.
thing is happening here in the United States with the civil rights movement in the South right now, coming to a better understanding of what really happened, which has been so covered up. But tell us something about your movement of Le Châssis.
Le Châssis. It is maybe the first chapter that I mentioned before, because one has a political class that has no memory of its crimes. And that actually has to answer to not only to history, but to any form of jurisdiction, and to say why they kill so many Cameroonians, why they kill so many people. And one will have to find a scenario through which the families will actually have to reconnect to their past and compensations, etc. But the bottom line of that is that one has to put that political class into its well-deserved retirement. And chassement is a composition out of the word chasser, which is to chase them away from power, to chase them away from what makes them, transforms them into vampires, and for the body politics actually to renew itself. I don't see any way out of that, indeed, if you take the constellation of Cameroonian history since the 50s and 60s, where you have a political class that hasn't renewed itself. You have one political party that has kept, the mantle of power since 1956, from 1956 until today. So you have a political personnel. It is really the same people, from the ruling class to the army, the generals, etc. You can have the civil war. You have that's where they had their own training, and that's what they're applying now in the battlefields of Southern Cameroon. So with that, one needs really what I would call a popular uprising. And I think there is no country where a renewal of the political system has happened without the people themselves taking back their history. And chassement is the Cameroonian people in general taking back their history, claiming ownership of their own body, of their own history, of their own political landscape, and making out of it what they want. And I've insisted on dialogue very often on those social bonds, creating the new social bonds, creating the new structures that are necessary for that to happen. I tend to mention as an example, in a country like that, that is where conflicts appear and where suddenly, for instance, in the 50s, during the 80s, during the 70s, and now with Anglophone, suddenly the state decides to kill, hundreds of people from this tribe, hundreds of thousands of people from that other tribe. In such a state, it is necessary to have an office of reconciliation, for instance, of mediation, where people of different religious faith, of different ethnic background, etc., will come together and craft a language of how one can speak with each other institutionally, to make sure that minorities are not threatened all along. Such a structure will have to come out of such Chassemont, right? Yes. So it is something positive. That's what I'm trying to say. A renewal of the social fabric.
Well, I learned something in this discussion from our learned professor and brother, that the people who are ruling Cameroon now, the dinosaur that's ruling Cameroon now, is the dinosaur that killed our patriots.
Oh, yes. Oh, yes.
Yeah. So, and it is very, very good to remind even our brothers Francophone that we are talking that on the English side, the people who fought for independence from Nigeria, they came back home and they formed those patriots, they formed different parties. They competed amongst themselves. So there's a different level of understanding here. If you give the opportunity for people, for the patriots, when they fight and get the independence themselves, they will actually know how to cherish the land. But when people who wanted to stay under bondage are given that opportunity to continue to remain under bondage, that is the problem that we have now, and that is the problem that really is on the Francophone side, because since 1960, there's only been one person ruling.
Oh, wow, that's amazing. Well, we're running out of time, but you have a lot to make happen in Cameroon.
Certainly, certainly.
And I hope that this program will help to educate people about the history.
Yes.
It's so important, as you said, for people to understand their history.
It is.
And I hope that this program will play at least a little part in that. Thank you so much for coming in.
Thank you.
May I also take the opportunity, Wendy, to thank LTC and the people of Lowell for giving us this opportunity to carry our message on the world stage. And I would also pay tribute to Professor Nganang for flying in for this program. That shows his commitment, not only in words, but actions speak louder than words. So thank you very much.
Thank you so much, and thank you for watching. So informative. Excellent.
Yes.
Hey, my brother.
Yes, somebody, somebody.